Recently, I read something, Sean, where I know you came back once from New York and you told the family, we sat around the table and you told us you did a DNA test and you told us what the results were and what it showed. But I recently read that that company is actually going bankrupt. And I think was this as the Section 9?
Well, what happened was, so the company, I mean, I'll tell the story in a minute about like my experience with this, with DNA and what we found out.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try and like be sometimes vague, so because I don't want to disclose like people's names and so on. But okay, so what you're referring to is 23andMe, which is the company that does it's probably one of the biggest company that does DNA testing. Is basically they were in March they applied for what's called Chapter 11 bankruptcy,
Oh,
and it kind of emerged that this company, which is the most like has like 15 million people clients who have taken these DNA tests to find out like health conditions, missing family members, ancestry, etc. That this company was in trouble. One, that it had lost a lot of money because what used to be, and I looked at some numbers, like in 2021 it was like a $6 billion business, and now it's only worth 48 million. That's like that's a crazy decline,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's because there's many other companies doing this kind of testing, and also it turns out these companies aren't very good at protecting people's data. So, in fact, this company, 23andMe, they had a data breach a couple of years ago where lots of people's data were being, somebody had hacked
Right.
data and the data was now all over the internet. So they applied for this thing called Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which is they're unable to pay their debts, or they overwhelmed. There's too much debt, because they don't have people buying this kit. You should buy the kit, you take a test, uh, you spit into it, or you kind of um, move it around
Swab.
your mouth. Yeah. So people don't necessarily want to take, because you take a test once. I'm not going to take if I take this one test, I take it once. I'm not going to keep taking a test.
Yeah.
I know the result. Maybe I want you to take the test, or a dad, or a cousin, so we could, if we're trying to get to some result, we're going to ask
Yeah.
more and more people to take it. The other one was they've started firing people, because if you don't, if enough people are taking tests, then you don't need so many workers, and especially they have a division which can see like whether you have traits for like high blood pressure or difficulty. Women have difficulty in giving birth and so on. So they fired a lot of the research part of the company. And so, to make a long story short, in the last month, stories began appearing saying, what you should do, if you have your data with them, you should delete it,
Oh
because
wow.
if they're in Chapter 11, which they can still sell stuff, they're still
Yeah.
doing business. You can still do a test with them. But if they're falling apart and they're going to sell the business to somebody else, it means your data, that
That
other
info.
company,
Yeah.
I don't know what the agreement's going to be, might buy your data. So your data is going to be with this other company. So you were being advised in like many newspaper articles, news stuff on the internet, TV news reports saying, look, download all your data and then basically like delete your account, which is what I did. Like you should just like get off this this thing. But the point that you're asking about, what you sort of saying, I came to Cape Town and I showed you guys this stuff. So what happened was, and we've mentioned this before, our father, he's kind of, he's what you would say mixed heritage. He's actually a mixed heritage. His mother, as I said before in this program, she is a descendant of people who were brought from Mozambique. They came, they were brought, no, not they came, they were brought as slaves to South Africa. It's unclear, like whether they came like at the end of the 17th or the beginning of the 18th century. So whether they came, oh sorry, David just gave me some technical advice there. Well done, David. So they came at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th, as slaves. They lived mostly around Cape Town. what's called Kirstenbosch, Newlands, that whole area. And then she met somebody, our grandmother met somebody. Her last name was Josephus, but her mother married a man called Jacobs. In any case, she met a guy and they had a child, which is our dad. Now, he never knew who his father was, but, instead of talking to him, I would say, do you want to know who your dad was? And I think we were in a post office one day. He was trying to get the license for that car that the little car that he drove up until recent.
Oh, yeah.
And he got really emotional, and because I always talk to him about this, like, yeah, why don't you find out? So that's when I was like, I started doing research by asking somebody to go to the government office, like in Rouland Street. There's an archive, like a government archive, and they found the same things that I had found. Well, I did it first, and then I got somebody to do the research. I paid like a young history student, and you'll find these government documents that list his mother's name, but does not list his father's name. I did another one where I went to the Anglican Church, which collects when people get baptized, they record the birth. Like when you, wat noem hulle, word opgegee.
Yeah.
So go to church. Like in those days, they baptize babies, not like the evangelicals who baptize adults. These people baptize babies, the Anglican Church. So in this church in Claremont, it's close to like the Cavendish Mall, you go there, and I went to look at these records. And there again, I saw my grandmother's name. I saw my father's name. Well, our father. I don't know why I say my father, our father's name. But I didn't see his father's name. So I was like, okay, this is getting really hard to figure out who his father was. And also, we have to say this for the sake of our listeners. If our family, they were people who were brought as slaves from Mozambique, which means they were Black Africans. If you see our father, he looks almost white. So this kind of stuff, we know generally that in Cape Town, and there's researchers like this woman, Susanna Clausen, has done this work in the late 30s or early 40s when Dad was born. There was this kind of general atmosphere in which white men were having children with Black or colored women. And then there was this moral panic around this, like there were these white men sleeping with Black women. And so the government, that's where all that politics came about the Immorality Act, the Mixed Marriages Act, because they were like dealing with the fact that all these white men were sleeping with Black women. So, okay, does the story make sense up until this point? Is there anything I'm leaving out? Because I want to get to the DNA part.
No, you're spot on there. You're spot on there. You keep
going. So then I was like, okay, this is impossible. I mean, I have to say one other quick thing. Asking an older person in that colored community, hey, what do you know about this birth of this individual? And I could say this now because all our father's uncles are now gone. Uncle Charlie was his mother's youngest brother. And so this is a guy, if you look at me on social media, Twitter, I used to put up my visits to Uncle Charlie. I loved Uncle Charlie. Short little man,
scrum off.
Great scrum off in rugby. Also, if you see Uncle Charlie looks Black. So it's like, yo, you take photos of Uncle Charlie and our dad, they're standing next to each other. You're like, what? But that's normal. That's Cape Town. In Cape Town, people kind of have, among our sisters and brothers, not everybody looks like there's like a gamut of color. But in any case, so when you ask these old people, like, yo, I was like, Charlie, how do you know? Do you know anything about this? Like, who's my grandfather? Who's mine? David, and our sister's grandfather. And he would say, I don't know. But it made sense. Uncle Charlie is about 10 years older than Dad, which means if Dad's father was around, Uncle Charlie was like 10.
Yeah.
So it's like 10-year-olds are not paying attention to the things. And yes, and you know this. Groot mens dinge.
It was a different era. Yeah, it was children must be seen and not heard. So you're not going to ask questions about these things. You just know, Suzella said, there's an uncle that's coming around, and that's about it.
Or there's no uncle. I mean, even we grew up around with kids who were like, we don't know who that kid's father is. Mostly father, right? You're just like, given what we were just saying about the dating show, but it's like, and men. So mostly like they don't see who these fathers are. And our father, I mean, if he was watching this now, or if we had brought him on, he would tell you some of that stuff did affect him. I mean, he had a quite a wild like teenage life, and as a young adult, he was an alcoholic. And I think some of that was affected by this. But to move forward with the story, so I'm like, yo, I can't find this out. Nobody knows nothing. There's very little. These people also mostly, they were either illiterate or they did not finish high school. So, and on top of it, if you're dealing with colonialism, and then when our father was born, apartheid happened like 6 years after he was born. So you're dealing with forced removals, you being locked out of certain jobs, your school, like your kid, there's no chance that your kid necessarily might even have like a decent schooling and therefore like an interesting career. So with all of that, it's like, I don't expect them even to know any of this or to find this out. But also it means they probably not like, if you're doing the history of a middle-class person, that you're going to find a lot of documents. These are regular poor people. They're not necessarily going to document all these things unless the Anglican Church is documenting it. And as I said to you, all the Anglican Church did in some cases where the people weren't married, they just put the mother's name and they didn't put the father's name. And now I want to make the transition to DNA. But tell me quickly what you had a question.
No, I just want to ask, like, was there a reluctance do you think there was a reluctance, not just in our family, but in a lot of families that went through the same situation, to not know and just, like leave it in the past? We're not going to try and dig up any information because it might just cause more harm than good, because it might just lead to some hurt and some pain that like a lot of people have obviously suppressed over the years and don't not want to talk about.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that this is the story of that community. In that community, Coloreds, there's lots of writing about this. I would recommend the work of Zoe Wickham on shame, Dimitri Erasmus. These are people who want to read about this stuff. These academics who write about this stuff. That there was slavery had happened. In slavery, there was often miscegenation, like die baas het geslaap met die slawe, die goeders. So it's like with that, and then there was also like a thing about there was another thing, biblical. People are very religious, and they had taken on this. The whites had spread as part of kind of white supremacist Christianity. Had told them that they are the children of Ham, which, let me say this quickly, Ham, meaning when Noah was drunk, and I think he was naked or something. This is a sort of biblical reference. And one of his sons laughed and didn't cover him. He didn't put clothes on his father. That guy his name was Ham. So this thing was the persona wat hom nie, those who didn't cover him, they are the children of Ham. They Ham. That is what Ham vanaf of course. Ham, you are like detritus. You are like wrong. You're doing bad stuff. You are doomed to failure and alcoholism and suffering. So in that context, there's no pride on ancestry, not in a racial way. I'm not talking like sort of Afrikaner nationalism. I'm just talking like, who are you? Where are you from? That stuff didn't exist. What did start happening, which is after apartheid, as people were searching through this stuff, that's when all that stuff about Khoisan comes out from. Yeah. When people felt shame because of slavery, shame because of miscegenation, shame because of all the things that went with how they experienced apartheid. So now they had to get pride back.
They needed identity. They needed an identity.
That's what Khoi.
To what existed, and they went, we are Khoi. We believe this is we're the first peoples, and then it just made them feel like they were part of a better identity. So we're not going to worry about.
And so to explain that, what did the Khoi do? What did the slaves do? To be enslaved means you're lost. You defeated. You are like nothing. To be a Khoi, and I'm saying one other part to that in a minute. The Khoi actually were not enslaved. The Khoi fought wars against the Dutch, like a series of wars of independence against the Dutch. So the Khoi in that thing in which in a sort of revisionist idea of who we are in the sort of black identity politics, people like to emphasize kings and queens. Come on, I live in America. This is that sort of language. King, your queen. So beyond that, people love to appeal to that history. The Khoi had kings. That's why you now see there's all these dudes declaring themselves kings in Cape Town, because that's an affirming identity. Khaled is something that was, we said this last week when I think we were talking about Tyler or something, or a couple of episodes ago. It's to do with alcoholism. Well, it's associated with marriage out of wedlock, all this stuff. Now, to your point, so to bring it home, if you're having in a community in which you have a single mom just having a kid, and no one knows who this kid's father is, that's normal in that place. Therefore, you don't talk about this stuff. I mean, it's very painful to think it through. So it's in that context that I was like, okay, we're working class people. I mean, people don't know the people who know us know this. We grew up very working class. Our family were gardeners, worked for the gardens.
Workers.
Yeah, they worked for the customers' gardens. They worked, they did physical labor. So that's why I said they didn't have time or the luxury to write up family histories. So therefore, I'm not like hard on them. I get it. So in that context, I was like, okay, what else is there to do? And the light went on. I'm going to do a DNA test. So I'll quickly go over the stuff from the DNA, and then I'll like this like a press conference, and I will take some questions. So here's what happened with the DNA thing. Firstly, generalizable stuff, not the specifics, not about family members and that. And I want you to ask me about that in a minute. But if you just take generally, what did I find out? I found out stuff that just confirmed what we kind of already knew and what our father had told us. One was this. They supply you with this thing. It's like a timeline. And what you can see on this timeline is that between that my DNA, and I'm only talking about mine because nobody else in our family has taken this test. I've asked others to take it. Maybe you should try to take it. And I think you'll get the same results. Yeah. But it would be interesting to see what appears on yours. I think it's going to be exactly, I'm hoping, kind of the same. Although they say there's a lot of variation with the stuff. But in any case, so what does it show with mine? It shows that there's a couple of dominant things that it shows between like the 16th, 17th century and so on, 18th century. There's a strong like DNA trait from the people from southeastern Africa, southeastern and central Africa, meaning Congolese. I mean, it literally says this. What is now Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, but particularly Mozambique. So that makes sense. The people who came were our ancestors on our grandmother's side, our paternal grandmother, our father's mother's side, Uncle Charlie and their people. They were known in Cape Town as what? Mozbiekers, meaning there are people from Mozambique. So the DNA just confirmed something that I already knew. It then fast forwards and says like in 1930, 1940, white DNA. I was like, oh, okay, okay, thank you. Some white DNA. Or it's not racial. What you have to say is like DNA found mostly among whites.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
European,
but specifically it says French, Dutch, German. So again, if you know the east of South Africa, who came with slavery? The majority of slaves came from Mozambique, Madagascar. No majority, the plurality, about 50% combined. The others came from Indonesia, other islands, India, and so on. That's why they say Malay and all that stuff in Cape Town. So, and I want you to ask me later because I left that out when I said like there's like to be of slave descent is negative, but there was one kind of slave identity that actually persisted that has been good at how it survives. But anyway, so there's the white one is French, German, Dutch, and we know that is what became basically Afrikaners. So that's that one part right there. The other generalized thing that they also show you is they break it down by percentages.
So they get technical.
Yeah, they get technical. Thank you. There, they get technical. So they get technical where they show you that the largest part of our identity, you could call it Black African.
Yeah.
That's about almost 49% or something. And most of that identity is, again, from that part of Southwestern Africa. Mozambique. Yeah. It's Nguni. It's meaning like, Nguni means like Xhosa, Zulu, Ndebele, whatever. Chonga, whatever, Shangaan. It's like that identity. That's who the people who were brought to the Cape. So that makes sense. We're not like, there's some other minor ones. We're very, well, I'm saying me, I say we. I have my DNA from like Khoi African. They in the 23andMe, they call it African hunter-gatherer, which is basically San. That's like really, like, it's not, I think it's like just under 2%. It's under 2%.
Yeah.
So okay. There's like some, which also for me tells me something. I mean, this is mostly the DNA from the other technical thing is the DNA comes through my father, but some of it through my mother even suggests that even for my mother, it's African, Black African. But again, we know that there's all this Khoisan talk in the Cape. So the other interesting part is, so then it also breaks down the white thing again. It confirms that thing about the 1940s. Our father was born in 1942. And I'll stop there because then there's another part. And of this part, I have to be careful how much information I give away. People who've done this test, they know this. There's another part where you can actually see a family tree and you can see what's called relatives. So you can click on. But
Sean, you got to explain to people the reason why you see that is because some of these people have taken the test themselves and they have the info, and because there's info, if for argument's sake the DNA matches in some way, they are made aware that you have another relative that tested recently, and so on and so forth. So they kind of
let's deal with that. Good point. Thank you for this. Intrigue. When you're on this thing, anybody who takes this test, they can see other people's tests. They can see not the whole test, things like they can see like, oh, we are related this way. I'm your second cousin. I'm your third cousin. You can then decide whether you want to connect with them. You write to those people and say, hey, can I connect with you? Can we exchange information? Because I can see you're my second cousin. So I want to know how are we third. So you say things like,
I'm laughing before the time,
No, you say something. You just write to them and say like, bro, this is an actual conversation I had with somebody in this thing. You say, our grandfathers are brothers. Yeah. So,
the suspense.
What was your grandfather's name? Yeah. That's what you could say to somebody in the DMs. It's like a DM system. Yeah. They have like a DM. It's like messages. I think it's called like relatives. I don't have it in front of me now. So you could do that. You can actually find that out. Then that person who you're writing that to, you'll get a diagram that shows like this is your name, this is your father, like there's like a tree, a family tree, and above your father there's your father's father. And how do I know it's about your father? Because lower down it says they've looked at the DNA matches, and the DNA match for you happens through your father. So it's like, this is the person I'm looking for. So this is all, but to answer, like, just I want to, you make a good point, which is like everybody who takes the test can see, can actually, if they set their settings, they can see anybody else who they related to. And the system, every time there's a new person takes the test and there's a match, you get a message that says, I found another match, and it will say something like, when you click on the relatives thing, it will say David Jacobs, third cousin once removed. Then you click on David Jacobs' profile, and it will show you that David Jacobs' great grandfather's whatever was because they don't want to say grandfather, they say
grandparent because they're trying to make sure that it might be it might be through a matrilineal line or something, but in my case it's through the male line, but it will show you like this is how you related. You can actually see that stuff. And I want to just tell one quick story. There was one where I found like a distant relative. I'm gonna be vague. Let me be vague because maybe one day when she's okay, I'll tell it when I write something about this. So one was I found like this person who's a very prominent white South Afrikaner politician who had married. You should not say anything because we don't want to get anybody in trouble. This person married into a very prominent white political family in South Africa, and it turns out that person was our cousin, like a distant cousin, fourth or something. Yeah. But the point was somewhere up there,
over the rainbow.
Over the rainbow. That's not the title of this thing. I was going to call this episode "No DNA." You know that no DNA RSA. But in any case, I found that, and here's why I think it got frustrating in a way. And so now that I'm off that system, I can't go. If I want to pursue this, I'll have to write to these people separately now, or get a genealogist in South Africa to go and do more of this work and see, give them tell them all my information and all the stuff I found and say, hey, can you see if you can find more of this information for me? And I want to, and just when I'm done, and when you ask me, because race is also important, you're like, who does tests and what information do we get is actually also important. So I want to talk about that at the end. But in any case, so in one case, I did find a guy who was very close in this like relative thing. And I have written to those people, but I found that sometimes these people, they don't respond to you. Now, I can't blame them because sometimes they've taken this thing for other reasons. They might have taken it because they were
health reasons. Like you said, if you want to know if hereditary disease.
There's also in South Africa, whites take this test more than anybody else, and often they take it because it could get them passports. Britain, particular, like it's mostly like the UK and some other countries in the EU. It's not this new version of I'm going to be a refugee in America. Let's not talk about that today. We don't want to get in trouble in the US. But this is an older version of like I'm trying to find out I've got some ancestry in some place. So I don't know why, they have their reasons for why they haven't responded to us. I've made it clear to these people I do not want to become your friend. I'm just trying to find out who my father's father is. My father is 83 years old. He's somebody I know actually once said his life was like a Ethel Fugard play. It was hard. I think I would love for him to know who his father is. So it's like bizarre, like me just asking somebody, bro, who was your grandfather or who was your uncle? So I can so here's my theory on where we are. This is my theory, and then I'll answer maybe a couple of questions about this. And sorry, listeners, I'm doing a lot of the talking on this episode because I did this research.
It's on purpose. It's on purpose.
So here's my theory. Here's what I think we know. We know, and we're just talking about our father because our mother, that's her other, and we've spoken about our mom before, where she's from, the world she's from, and so on. But for our dad, we know enough about his mother's background. Her name was Caroline Josephus, and then she married a man called Carolus August, and this was she married him after my dad was actually born. After our dad was born, our dad's stepfather. He had two other siblings, a stepbrother Carl, and he had a sister Emmy, right? And actually Emmy's granddaughter just died this week, and I think they're burying her earlier today they buried her in South Africa, right? So if we'll visit that another time. Living in Cape Town, particularly, it's crazy, it's hard. So we'll talk about the tragedy of I think her name was, what was her name again? Shanice or something. But in any case, so what we know is we know his mother's story. We can, and we should deal with that another time. We know the community they're from, Kirstenbosch. But here's what I know about his father in a sort of very vague way, generalizable way. What I know is that during the Depression in the 1930s, a lot of Afrikaners came to the city. They were also very poor. This is why the National Party became obsessed with what they called the arm blanke vraagstuk, the poor white question, the poor white problem. They wanted to deal with these poor whites who they were afraid were going to fall into coloredness. But by coloredness, they meant poverty, like pathology.
Because the image of a white person has to do with being wealthy, having property, being in good stead. It wasn't supposed to be, I cannot look after myself. I'm going to become a laborer and earn X amount of money. The look didn't fit. And
the fact was there was a lot of poor whites, bro. There was a lot of poor whites who live in the same ghettos as black people.
Post-apartheid, there was a lot. There was a lot.
Of course, what apartheid did, I will want to correct one thing there. Apartheid then implemented a massive affirmative action program.
Social programs for them.
Government jobs, in the
railway houses.
Yeah, like the banks, what they call Volkskas, Trustbank, which is basically meant to set up to help them get into the housing market, into businesses, run a farm.
I know you know. You probably do know. But to think that back in the day, the government would pay your debt for the house that you bought if you can no longer pay the bond. The government will then come up with the money to pay for that house, so you have somewhere to stay, you have property.
Were you talking about white people or everybody?
Yeah, white people. Yeah.
It was a whole program. This thing that I call the poor white problem, and I want to get back to our grandfather in a minute. Again, I'm not even sure if I can say our grandfather, because it's, I don't even know if the guy claimed us.
Yeah.
But the poor white problem thing was actually, there was a study. They commissioned a study, bro. The Carnegie Commission was an American private foundation whose job it was to study like what was happening with these poor Afrikaners and how to get them out of it. And there was like D.F. Malan. I was reading a thesis recently when D.F. Malan was a young priest, pastor, predikant, or whatever it was in whatever rural town he was working. Remember, D.F. Malan becomes the prime minister in 1948 when the National Party comes into power, and then they implement apartheid, right? When D.F. Malan was young and where he was like serving, what do you call it? Like where he was the priest, the local priest for the Engre Kerk in this town, he was obsessed with these whites who were living on the rand, on the edge of the dorp, this dorp he was at, and that was living kind of with the coloreds because they're falling into coloredness. So there was an obsession with that stuff. Now, but to make a point, it's to say at this time in the late 30s, early 40s, there were a lot of these communities in like Newlands, Krotbuurte, shanties, like it wasn't a non-racial paradise, but there were definitely some poor whites living among majority black communities. By black communities, I mean coloreds and Africans, mostly colored at that time. Now, so we know that what most likely happened in a general sense is that there was a moral panic around the fact that there were these people living together. And I don't know if this guy then got scared.
I'm sure they probably gave him an ultimatum. If you because I heard the story. If you stay, you then lose your whiteness. If you go, obviously you'll have a better life. And
he chose whiteness, yeah. And again, I'm not going to be hard on people, but he did choose whiteness. So we don't know, like, so the moral of the whole, not the moral. Where I am with this work, it's kind of research I keep doing, and I'm trying to write. Actually, eventually, I want to write what I want to call a personal history of South Africa, and I'm modeling it on this idea of an Irish writer who does a similar project, where you write
about your family, but you sort of write about the place, and you kind of go in between these general things that are happening and what are happening to these specific people. And I don't, and I was going to say about the DNA, and I said at the beginning, when I said to you, we should come back to the idea of like, who takes the tests and why do they take the tests, and why is it that we know so much now about these white people? I think there's an obsession. We know this in place, particularly in Cape Town, where we're from, by a lot of colored people who are obsessed with finding their white relatives.
Yeah.
In our case, it just happened that that's the missing person that we're trying to locate. We're not locating this person so we could be closer to whiteness or because it's going to make us feel better. We just want to know who our grandfather is.
It's for our father mainly.
Our father. But it is true that in Cape Town, there's an obsession with this, with kind of like
my grandfather's mother's brother, mother's boyfriend or husband was white. You know, that will come out first.
Oh, you mean like this is the sort of language here that people deploy? He was a German. Hy's van Britannia, but dan sê regtig research en dan vind ze uit, hulle is ook Mozbiekers.
Yeah. But they're not going to claim that side of their family.
Yeah. Because there's an insistence on this history. But in any case, that's the. I don't know if you have any other questions on this.
No. Look. You mentioned that there's a slave identity that you think is something that you're proud of earlier on. Can you elaborate on that?
So this is another aspect of this history that I think, and of sort of Cape identity that I think people will eventually. It's going to take a minute, but people will get there. I think there was slave identity is there. Die klopse.
Of course, yeah.
Die tweede nuwe jaar, which everybody will tell you is die baas, die plaas, die slawe eienaars het partytjie gehou op die eerste. They held a party on the first, and the slaves had the second New Year. They could come through the city. Eventually, it turned into after the end of slavery, they had this parade. It grew into this idea of the klopse. It has its own crazy history with blackface and so on. But luckily, people have abandoned that. But that's part of slavery there.
Yeah.
If you're in Cape Town, you'll see there's actually a place where there were auctioned slaves. It's on Plain Street, I think. Plain by like Roland. No, Plain and that little street that runs Val. Is it Val? No. I'm going to remember. Where I used to work, Itasa was on that street. It's the little street that connects Plain, which I think, does Plain go up by Parliament? I could be wrong about this. And then there's Adderley, and then there's a slave museum there on the corner. And then there's this little road where I used to work. There's also they put up a big monument to slavery. So what they've actually found, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Yeah. What they found, because earlier you actually glitched. What they found was that the plurality or the majority of the people when they did census were of slave descent. But somehow, like, people go on about being something else, people want to be Khoi, people want to be, Khoi San. This is the new language. So I think for me, I'm not saying I'm necessarily proud of it. I just say, like, I'm more aware that, like, that's who we are.
Yeah.
I think it has to do also with racial politics.
I
People
think
want to be different and separate.
Yeah.
I know that there's black people who came from Mozambique. It then turned out that there was a white person who had a child without, that's how our father came into the world. Yeah.
Look, it's history, and I understand the other side of the family that did the DNA test, whether they're now 4 or 5 times removed. They obviously have to battle with the same thing that they now have to kind of deal with the fact that their uncle had a separate family, probably to a family that he had.
I don't even know if he had a family. Let's not give the guy.
Okay. I mean, he had a child, a legitimate child with a colored woman, and he probably had another family later on, and this information would threaten that family dynamics that
their understanding of themselves, their memories of their grandfather.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. It's a lot to take in. I'm sure, I'm hopeful that
after such a long time also for everybody involved in this stuff, it's like, but that's the thing. I think what I sometimes hate about South Africa is I think South Africans do not want to deal with the
past.
the past, the violence of it. Violence was done here to our grandmother, to our father. It's violence. I'm sorry, it's a form of violence, and people don't want to deal with this stuff. They don't. It's hard for people to come to terms with the fact that they have an uncle, like, or who had this child, right?
Yeah.
And it's not a. I will say about that distant relative, the one who I said who got into this prominent family. We've spoken on the phone. We were both like, "What? This is crazy." It wasn't like, because I know her. It was a good meeting, so that's different. That's somebody who's fully South African, who's makes sense of our Creole nature. That's a different story. But there, obviously, I'm dealing here with a lot of people. Also, can I just say this other quick thing? Hold on for 1 second. I have to. Why don't you just keep talking, because I want to just switch something off here.
Oh, yeah, no, look, from my side, I obviously think that the family itself wouldn't be able to deal. I even think people in our family, I don't know if they would want to find out who our grandfather is. I think it might be an issue for them as well. So yeah, I don't know. It's a lot of information for people to take in, and we are sharing with people that are listening to us, and I'm sure they have their own family situations and stories. Some people might be similar to ours, No, this happened to one family. It's not an isolated thing. There was a lot of people. Look, if you actually wanted to go deeper with this, there was colored people with lighter complexion who took on the roles of whites and moved to either England or Australia and those places so that they could claim whiteness. So, and I promise you today, those people do not want to know that their colored family is reaching out to them, because they have claimed a different race later on. What was the test they used to do? Take a needle pen and put it through.
Passing. There was a passing.
And see if it flows through, then then you're good. If it doesn't flow through, then okay.
I have a friend, that same friend I mentioned, Zoe Wickham, who wrote the book, was written on slavery. She actually wrote a whole novel about passing, about this family who lives, like fictional family, of course. And in fact, some of her own relatives, I mean, this is all well known, people can Google this, they passed. But she, in this novel, which is about this woman who lives in Obs, like near the end of apartheid, and she then sort of figures out that the lady who she thinks is their maid is actually her grandmother, who lives in the house with them in this fictional world. It's fiction, but like in a place like they live in Obs in the story. And then apartheid is ending, and sort of what Zoe writes is what happens to when apartheid ends, if you're colored, you identified as colored or Xhosa, Zulu, whatever, under apartheid, you suffered visibly, or your family lived in abject poverty or whatever. You experienced apartheid as a victim. You can come out now and say, I'm free. But if you pass, what do you do?
Exactly. I think the question is, if you had that situation in front of you, what type of decision would you have made? What type of person would you have been? Would you have said, bro, I'm getting out of here, oppression, living like a colored in South Africa is not fair on myself and my family. I want to get out. So people must understand, I'm not blaming people for choosing that whiteness and running away, because there was obviously other situations. You were persecuted when you stayed in South Africa and you were colored and black, and you were treated as subhuman. So I fully understand why people took the opportunity and ran with it,
But so, what? I don't, to be honest with you, I don't have much time and energy for those people and their travails, how they suffered. Because I don't, for me, it's not like I don't actually think they suffered. I just want to find you the actual quote, because I think I mangled it when I said, hold on, let me see what she said. So his thing was to say, she says, we don't know how many of them there were. There's no discourse, no records, because after apartheid, they don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Because she said, we they didn't come out and say, I've stopped.
They got a new identity. Why would they?
Yeah, I stopped.
they've chiseled something, new. So they're not going to come back now and say, "Oh, post-apartheid." My grandfather was actually colored when he came to, to England or Australia or wherever, and this is who we are. No, they're not gonna do that. So
anyway, we should end here. This was a great episode, by the way. Pretty heavy episode.
Yeah.
But we always wanted to talk about this. And the fact that they shut down that DNA thing made me say, hey, you know what? Just tell this.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully if I do more research and I get more new findings on these histories. I mean, the history just of our grandmother, by the way, in itself is interesting. Not even on the story of like wisdom.
And like you said, look, I'm doing a course now in tourism, and the stuff that you mentioned earlier on kind of links into the slave trade, how the Dutch came here, the French Huguenots, all those things. How they set up wine farms and had slaves, how slaves were living in the castle at the bottom, all these things. It has influence on our lives. You can trace these things, and that DNA thing I think is amazing, especially if they can give you a timeline and tell you this is what happened. This was your great grandfather at this stage, or great grandfather. This is how he came to South Africa. So I think it's amazing. I think everybody.
When we meet again, I'll let this linger for the next episode, because there's other sources that I also used, which are very unconventional. But you're like, hold up, I can find out more if I look at these documents. Yeah. I don't want to say that. This is just an invitation to people to come back to the show. The last thing I wanted to do quickly is, it's actually, when we're recording this, it's our mother's birthday. Our mother was born on April 16 of 1942 and sadly died in August of 2020. So today would have been her birthday, which means she would have been 80. Yeah.
Yes.
80
yes.
today, so, I mean, quite a heavy episode. Remember our mom, and to her memory, this is why we do these things, because of, anyway.
I mean, I was not the easiest kid growing up, so yeah. I told Sean earlier on, I'm just grateful that I had the opportunity to spend some great times with my mom, and we had a wonderful understanding. You know what I'm saying? So there's always time to fix anything that's a bit off at some stage. So yeah, to everybody out there,
the chance to fix it. I think what the important thing is, like, while she was alive, you had the opportunity.
Yeah, appreciate your moms, appreciate your dads. If you have the time to spend with them, do it. That's what you do in life that counts. And to everybody out there, just keep on watching, share with people. Hope you guys enjoyed a bit of information from our lives, a bit of our genealogy and heritage. And we don't mind sharing that with you guys, because we feel it's important to us and the way we are wired. And it says a lot about us, knowing where you come from. So I'm just excited about sharing more with you guys.
Excellent episode, brother. Episode 9. That's a wrap. Episode 9.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, everybody.
Okay.